My name is Gabriel Morales, and I work as a real estate agent. My day-to-day consists of showing houses, negotiating prices, and finding buyers. However, this task was a bit different. This time, I didn't have to convince someone to buy, but rather I had to discuss the sale price of a property. The owner of the house, Dona Ofelia Santos, was an elderly woman who had decided to sell her home and had chosen us to handle the sale. Before going, I studied the documents and the price ranges suggested by my company. I felt ready to negotiate, but I couldn't have imagined what I would find when I arrived. The house was located in a somewhat isolated part of town, not too far, but just enough to give a sense of solitude. The facade, curiously, was beautiful, an old colonial-style building with dark wood details and large windows. It seemed like a peaceful place full of history. I rang the doorbell, and Dona Ofelia opened the door. Her appearance unsettled me a bit. Her face showed years of weariness, and her sunken, dull eyes reflected something more than just fatigue. She seemed fed up, as if selling the house was just another burden in her life. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed completely. What from the outside looked like a picturesque home was, on the inside, eerie. The walls were covered in yellowish wallpaper that seemed to be peeling off, and the light was dim, as if the lamps could barely illuminate the house. But what disturbed me the most was what I saw when I reached the living room, a massive collection of porcelain dolls. The dolls were arranged on shelves that started from the floor and went up, covering almost all the walls. Some were pristine, with perfect faces and bright eyes. Others looked older, with cracks in the porcelain and messy hair. They all seemed to be staring at me, or at least that's how it felt, with their unmoving glass eyes. Dona Ofelia invited me to sit down. "I know what you're thinking," she said suddenly, as if she could read my mind. "Don't worry, I won't take them with me. They'll stay here with the house." I didn't know how to respond. All I could think was that if a potential buyer saw those dolls, they'd run away. But I couldn't tell her that directly. As she spoke about her urgency to sell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that room, in those dolls, was out of place. "Do you like dolls, young Morales?" she asked me suddenly, with a faint smile. Before I could answer, she added in a lower tone, "They like company." I didn't know whether to laugh nervously or pretend I hadn't heard, but at that moment, for the first time, I wished this negotiation would end as quickly as possible. Dona Ofelia let out a dry laugh that chilled my blood. In a sarcastic tone, she said, "It's a joke. I know the dolls are creepy, I admit it. But there's something you should know. Each of those dolls represents a member of my family. When one of us dies, the one who remains is responsible for making a porcelain doll with the same features as the person in life. That's how we preserve the memory of our loved ones. But I'm tired of it. I'll accept any price you offer me." My mind was paralyzed, but the old woman continued. "That said, there's one condition. The house is sold with the dolls. I won't take them with me, and honestly, I don't care what the new owner does with them." I was stunned. I didn't know whether to laugh or feel uncomfortable. I looked into her tired eyes, searching for signs that this was all another joke. However, her gaze left no room for doubt. I felt a chill run down my spine. To end the moment, I gave her the lowest price within the range my company had stipulated. To my surprise, she accepted without argument and signed the documents with unexpected firmness. "Here are the keys to the house," she said as she handed them to me. "I'll move out immediately. Good luck with this house. You'll need it." With that last phrase, she walked out the front door with a small suitcase, as if she wanted to leave that place forever. Now I was alone in the house. Despite the apparent calm, I felt a weight in the air, as if the dolls lining the shelves were watching me intently. I decided to explore every corner to evaluate it before preparing it for sale. The house had 2 floors. The first level consisted of a small living room with antique furniture, a tiny but functional kitchen, and a bathroom with rusty pipes. I went up to the second floor, where there were 3 bedrooms. One of them was the master bedroom, empty except for an old bed. The second room seemed to have been some kind of study, with shelves full of dusty books and a small desk. The last one was the most unsettling, a storage room filled with additional dolls, all in strange positions, as if they had been placed there on purpose to disturb. Although the structure of the house was solid, the dolls remained the most disturbing element. Every time I walked near them, I felt their glass eyes following my every move. I remembered what Donna Ophelia had said. "I don't care what happens to the dolls." It was obvious that I would have to get rid of them before trying to sell the house. With that thought in mind, I closed the door and left. I would need time and logistics to move that grotesque collection. 2 weeks passed before I returned with a plan. I arrived with a moving truck, empty boxes, and a coworker to help me. However, as soon as I crossed the front door, an uncomfortable feeling washed over me. Something had changed. The dolls were still on their shelves, but their arrangement seemed different, as if someone had rearranged them. I didn't want to waste any more time. I started walking through the living room, assessing how many boxes I would need. But in the back of my mind, the old woman's warning echoed over and over. What if those dolls weren't just objects? What if they were somehow connected to the dead members of her family? The idea scared me, but I tried to rationalize it. It was all just absurd superstition, wasn't it? As we entered the house with my coworker, we hurried to start the work. The atmosphere was still oppressive, but we forced ourselves to ignore it. Carefully, we began taking the dolls off the shelves and placing them in boxes. Each doll seemed heavier than it should, as if its physical weight didn't match its size. We didn't say much as we worked. The silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional creak of the wood beneath us. Almost 2 hours later, we were at the last shelf when it happened. One of the dolls, the tallest one, dressed in a navy blue lace dress, fell. Everything happened in slow motion, the dry sound of the porcelain breaking as it hit the floor, and then something indescribable. From inside it came human organs. They weren't just objects, they weren't stuffing or some macabre trick. They were real organs. A decomposing heart, what looked like a liver, and, most disturbingly, a brain that was practically intact. The smell that filled the room was unbearable, a mix of rot and something chemical that seemed to cling to the throat. My coworker fell to the floor, vomiting while I stepped back, paralyzed by horror. When we regained some composure, we ran out of the house, leaving everything behind. Outside, we breathed the fresh air, trying to calm the panic consuming us. Once we were somewhat calm, though still trembling, we called the police. We didn't know what else to do. 2 patrol cars and an ambulance arrived. The officers entered the house cautiously while we recounted what had happened. An hour later, they came out with pale faces and confirmed what we already feared. All the dolls contained human organs inside. The discovery was grotesque, a macabre puzzle that no one could understand. The investigation dragged on for months. The company tried to locate Donna Ophelia to recover the money for the property, but she was no longer in the country. Her bank accounts had been emptied, and there was no trace of her whereabouts. Local media covered the story, but it soon became an unsolved mystery. The most unsettling part was that, despite the forensic efforts, they were never able to identify the victims whose organs were inside the dolls. There were no matches in any DNA database, and the clues faded as if the owners of those organs had never existed. Now, as I remember what happened, a sense of hopelessness overwhelms me. Donna Ophelia's tired smile and her final words echo in my mind. "The house is sold with the dolls. Good luck with this house. You'll need it." I can't help but think that everything was meticulously planned. Donna Ophelia used us to get rid of something dark and perverse, and now that weight has fallen on our hands. It's as if she passed on a curse, a horrifying inheritance that should have never left that house. The question still lingers in my mind. Why? What kind of person could do something like that? Maybe I'll never know. But what I do know is that, in this world, there are horrors that not even logic can explain, and some mysteries should remain buried. Next story. My name is Daniel Sanchez, and this is a story from my childhood that still haunts me, like a shadow that never completely disappears. I was 8 years old when I lived with almost my entire family in a humble house in the countryside. The house was small and old, with wooden walls that creaked at the slightest movement and roofs that barely withstood the rain. Living there were my grandmother, my 3 uncles, my mother, my cousin Clara, and me. We were a large family, and although we didn't have much, there was always laughter and warmth. My cousin Clara was special to me. At 20 years old, she was like a second mother to me. She always took care of me, played with me, and helped me with my schoolwork. But there was something about Clara that I never fully understood, her devotion to a porcelain doll. The doll was old, with a delicate pink dress, blonde hair that looked real, and bright blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. The story of how that doll came into our family always struck me as strange. According to my grandmother, when she was young and working in the fields, a woman came to her house with a debt she couldn't pay in cash. The woman carried the doll with her, and my grandmother, who had never seen something so refined and beautiful, accepted it as payment. Back then, the doll was an unthinkable luxury, and although my grandmother had always cared more about practical things than pretty ones, something about that porcelain face convinced her. Over the years, the doll passed from one person to another. First, it belonged to my mother, but she was never very interested in it, so it ended up with Clara, who cared for it as if it had always been hers. Clara cleaned it meticulously, brushed its hair, and sometimes even talked to it. I remember hearing her whisper things while staring at it, as if waiting for a response. To me, however, that doll was terrifying. It had a strange, unsettling presence that made me feel watched every time I was near it. The doll sat on an old chair in the hallway leading to the bathroom at the back of the house. Every time I had to pass by, especially at night, my heart would race. Even though I tried to convince myself it was just an inanimate object, I felt its eyes following me. No matter where I looked at it from, it always seemed to be watching me, as if it knew something I didn't. I remember one night in particular when I had to go to the bathroom. The house was completely silent, except for the creaking of the wood under my feet. As I passed the doll, I had the clear impression that its head had turned slightly toward me. I froze, sweating cold, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I took a step back and looked again. There it was, motionless, with that neutral expression that, for some reason, felt more sinister than any human gesture. I didn't tell Clara or anyone else. I didn't want to be called a coward or have them think I was crazy. But every time I had to walk down that hallway, I felt a knot in my stomach. There was something about that doll that wasn't right, something that felt out of place, as if it didn't belong in our house or even in the world we lived in. Over time, I started avoiding the hallway as much as I could, but in such a small house, that was almost impossible. And so, day after day, that doll became my greatest fear, an object that seemed to be waiting for something that, to this day, I wish I had never discovered. After that night when I swore the doll had turned its head to look at me, my life changed. I couldn't get those empty, cold eyes out of my mind, the ones that seemed to follow me everywhere. What troubled me the most was knowing that, even if I avoided it during the day, the nights offered no comfort. My room was small, a kind of makeshift storage space at the back of the house. It had no windows, just a door that creaked at the slightest movement. It was a dark, silent place, and it was becoming more terrifying by the day. It all started a few days after that incident in the hallway. It was around 5 in the morning when I heard the first knocks. Two soft knocks on the door, as if someone was there, waiting for me to open it. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. I stayed in bed, motionless, trying to listen for anything else. Could it be my mother? But no, she always woke me up an hour later, at 6, and she did so with a clear call from the other side of the door, not with those mysterious knocks. I took a deep breath and told myself it was probably the wind, some noise from the house, or even my imagination. It couldn't be anything else, right? But the next day, it happened again. Two knocks, identical to the ones from the previous morning. I didn't dare move. I knew no one in the house got up before 8, except for my mother, and she got up at 6. I curled up in my bed, trembling, and counted the minutes until I heard her usual voice at 6. "Get up, Daniel, it's time for school." That contrast was the strangest part. The knocks at 5 were soft, cautious, as if whoever was making them didn't want to wake anyone else. But my mother's voice was warm, firm, and ordinary, like a lifeline pulling me out of fear every morning. In the nights that followed, the knocks continued. Always at the same time, with the same pattern. I started feeling unbearable anxiety. I wasn't sleeping well, and when I did, I woke up startled, waiting for the 2 taps on the door. During the day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, armed with courage or perhaps pure desperation, I decided to face whatever was behind the door. It was 5 o'clock sharp when the knocks came again. My whole body tensed, but this time I got up. I walked to the door with trembling steps, each creak of the floor increasing my fear. I pressed my ear against the wood and tried to listen for anything, any sign that someone was there. But there was nothing, just silence. Finally, I grabbed the doorknob with shaky hands and opened it abruptly. What I saw left me frozen. Nothing. The hallway was dark and empty as always. But the air was colder than usual, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I slammed the door shut and locked myself in my room, feeling more vulnerable than ever. The next morning, I tried to talk to my mother. I asked her if she had been knocking on my door before waking me up. She looked at me strangely and shook her head. At 5 in the morning? Of course not, Daniel. You know I always get up at 6. You must have been dreaming. I wanted to believe her, but something inside me told me it wasn't a dream. In the following days, I started noticing something else. Every time I heard those knocks, I felt the atmosphere in my room change. The air became thick, heavy, and the silence was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat. And although I never opened the door in time to confirm my suspicions, something inside me knew the truth. Those knocks came from her. From the doll. It was an absurd idea, but everything fit. No one else in the house got up at that hour, and the knocks were so soft that they seemed to be made by small porcelain hands. But how could that be possible? It was just an object, right? I repeated that question over and over, but with each passing night, the idea that the doll was alive became harder to ignore. I knew something bad was happening, and though I didn't want to admit it, I felt I wouldn't be able to avoid it much longer. The fear I felt toward the doll had become unbearable. Every night was torture, and the knocks at 5 in the morning were pushing me to my limit. I decided to do something about it. I installed a bolt on my bedroom door. I thought that if I could isolate myself from whatever was coming in, I might finally sleep peacefully. The simple act of putting that bolt on gave me a false sense of security, as if a small lock could protect me from something so strange and terrifying. That night, after securing the door, I lay down and tried to fall asleep. At first, everything seemed calm, but that didn't last long. At 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a sound that chilled my blood. Someone was struggling with the door. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was clear, as if small hands were urgently trying to open it. The struggle lasted only a few seconds, but each second felt like an eternity. Then the noise stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I heard it. A laugh. It was soft, high-pitched, like the laugh of a little girl. It was impossible not to recognize it, the doll. It was on the other side of the door, and though I couldn't see it, I could feel its presence. My entire body froze as that laugh echoed in my mind. That's when I understood. It had been entering my room every night, exactly at 3 in the morning. At 5, it would leave the room and knock on the door to wake me up, as if it wanted me to know it had been there. What was it doing during those 2 hours? Why did it watch me from the chair in the hallway during the day and then enter my room in the dark? I had no answers, but fear consumed me. I didn't know what it wanted from me, but it was clear it had no intention of leaving me alone. That night, I didn't sleep another minute. As soon as the sun rose, I went straight to my mother. I told her I was scared, though I didn't go into too much detail. She, always practical, didn't ask many questions and simply let me sleep in her room. From that day on, I started avoiding my room as much as I could. I slept with my mother almost every night, but even then, I couldn't feel safe. Sometimes, while lying in her bed, I would look out the window, and there it was. The doll. I don't know how, but it would appear in the garden, staring straight at me. Its porcelain face was unchanging, but those blue eyes seemed to glow with a life of their own. I didn't tell my mother about this. What could I say? That a porcelain doll was following me? No one would have believed me. Deep down, I knew this wouldn't stop. No matter where I hid or how many bolts I put on the doors, it would always find a way to reach me. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the struggle at my mother's door. It wasn't my door now, it was hers. I froze completely, unable to move. Then the laugh returned. That same high-pitched, mocking laugh. I closed my eyes tightly, wishing it would all end. But in my mind, I could only imagine one thing. The doll's eyes, watching me in the dark, patiently waiting for the right moment for whatever it was planning. The feeling of being trapped, of having nowhere to go, consumed me. What did that doll want? Why was it so obsessed with me? And the most terrifying question of all, what would it do when it finally opened the door? The next morning, as we had breakfast, I heard my cousin talking to my mother. I didn't pay much attention at first, but then I caught something that made me stop chewing. They were planning to give the doll away. My cousin seemed convinced she didn't need it anymore. "It's time for someone else to enjoy it," she said, as if the doll were just any ordinary toy. My mother agreed. I don't know if it was because she had noticed my growing discomfort or because she also felt something was wrong. Either way, my cousin decided to get rid of the doll that same day. A few hours later, my uncle arrived in his old car to take my cousin and the doll. They wrapped it carefully in a box, as if they wanted to protect it, though in my mind I just wished they would destroy it. I didn't know if giving it away was the right thing to do, but I felt a small spark of relief as I watched it go. When they returned, they told me the doll now belonged to a girl in the neighboring town. "She seemed delighted with it," my cousin said with a smile. But I couldn't share her enthusiasm. Something deep in my soul told me this wasn't the end. That night, I slept with my mother as usual, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a little calmer. Still, I couldn't stop wondering if that girl, who now had the doll, would start noticing the same things I had. The slight movement of its head, the way its gaze seemed to follow you, the knocks on the door in the middle of the night. Sometimes, objects carry more than just memories. They carry stories, emotions, and, at times, something darker, something we don't understand. In my childhood innocence, I thought it was all over, but now, many years later, I understand that you can't escape something like that so easily. The things we don't understand don't disappear just because we pass them on to someone else. Maybe that doll was a kind of witness or a vessel for something that should never have existed. All I can hope is that, over in that neighboring town, that girl and her family have had better luck than we did. But in my heart, I know that some stories simply don't end. Next story. My name is Elias Montero, and I'm 39 years old. I'm a forensic pathologist, accustomed to facing the harshness of death and deciphering the stories that bodies silently tell. But today, what lies before me on the autopsy table doesn't seem to tell a story. Rather, it seems to scream one, and that scream is one of horror. As a child, my father used to tell me a story that fascinated and terrified me in equal measure, the Porcelain Man. It told the tale of a man who woke up trapped in the body of a porcelain doll. Though he lived adventures in search of reclaiming his humanity, the ending was dark. Unable to accept his non-human existence, the man threw himself off a cliff, shattering into pieces. Only then did he find freedom. I never thought that story would return to my mind as it has today, decades later. Before me lies the most grotesque thing I've witnessed in my years of practice. A real-life porcelain man. The corpse belongs, according to preliminary documents, to a man named Ignacio Fuentes, a 43-year-old sculptor who had disappeared 6 months ago under mysterious circumstances. But what lies before me can barely be described as a human body. Ignacio's skin was removed with surgical precision, revealing a structure of white porcelain that replicates his anatomy in chilling detail. His internal organs have been extracted and placed inside this sculpture as if they were pieces of a grotesque work of art. Even his bones were replaced by a ceramic framework, crafted to replicate his exact shape and proportions. The body was found in an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of San Arcadio, a small town with colonial buildings and an air of decay. According to the police report, the property had belonged to Augusto Vidal, an art collector who disappeared several years ago under equally strange circumstances. It was a group of teenagers exploring the mansion in search of adventure who found the corpse. At first, they thought it was a statue until they noticed the stench. The scene of the discovery was equally disturbing. The mansion was filled with porcelain dolls, each one different and all eerily lifelike. The officers reported that some of the dolls had real hair, and others had human teeth carefully embedded in their mouths. An inscription in Latin adorned the wall of one of the rooms, Vita post mortem, life after death. As I examine the corpse, a chill runs down my spine. The porcelain face, painted with unsettling precision, replicates Ignacio Fuentes' features. The eyes, though obviously artificial, seem to carry an expression of suffering and resignation. Among the belongings found at the scene, there's an object that makes my breath catch for a moment: a small porcelain doll. It's identical to one I had as a child, with the same crooked smile and empty eyes. A doll that shouldn't be there, but is. I remember my father's words as he narrated the ending of the Porcelain Man tale. "Only in destruction will you find freedom." This case isn't just another autopsy. I know there's something bigger and darker behind this corpse. Something that, like the story from my childhood, won't end well. The night was endless. As the light from the autopsy lamp illuminated the figure on the table, I felt increasingly trapped by the grotesque work of art before me. The porcelain, meticulously placed over every organ and bone, seemed like a perfect prison, one that forced me to dismantle everything to do my job. At first, it all seemed like a macabre joke. How could this be real? How could someone do something so meticulously horrifying? I had the responsibility of determining Ignacio Fuentes' cause of death, but as the porcelain crumbled under my hands, all I found were more questions and no clear answers. Was it suffocation? Poison? Trauma? Any of those explanations could be plausible, but none of them gave me peace. I decided to break the figure more decisively, using precision tools. The porcelain gave way with a repulsive crack, and as I uncovered the organs, I found something I hadn't expected: a message. But it wasn't on paper or any tangible object. It was written on the bones of the figure. At first, I didn't understand. It was as if the doll's bones were engraved with fine lines, and as I studied them more closely, I could read the words. It was a poem, written with a detail that left me frozen. I recited it under my breath, feeling the weight of each syllable like a condemnation. Porcelain dolls, fragile and fair, woven in a dream where nothing glares. When man falls and flesh decays, beauty persists where death lays. Seek the place where the wind whispers, where empty eyes watch and the soul murmurs. The poem, though seemingly simple, left me deeply unsettled. The mention of a place, of where the wind whispers, seemed to point to something more, something sinister. The reference to empty eyes and the soul murmurs resonated strongly, as if the dolls, which had been Ignacio Fuentes' obsession, were connected to a specific location. My heart raced as terror began to take hold of me. This wasn't just a murder. This was something much darker. Ignoring the message I had just found could mean letting something even more dangerous slip away. I immediately called the police, quickly explaining that I needed them to search for a specific location. Something inside me told me this wasn't an isolated case, that everything related to those dolls and this porcelain man was more intertwined than anyone could imagine. I asked them to investigate an area on the outskirts of San Arcadio, a place known for the dark legends surrounding it. It was an old cemetery forgotten by time, surrounded by dense forests where many claimed strange things happened. It had been forgotten by the town's inhabitants, but the words of the poem indicated that this area was where the truth had to be sought. The officers mobilized faster than I expected. Meanwhile, I stayed there, staring at the corpse and wondering if I would ever fully understand what had happened or if I was descending into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The hours dragged on, and just when I thought everything related to the porcelain man had come to an end, I received a call from the police. They told me to come to the San Arcadio cemetery immediately. They needed me. My experience with the previous case, they explained, was crucial to understanding what they had found. They didn't know how to proceed, and frankly, neither did I. Despite my reservations, I set out, thinking I might find another body transformed into porcelain. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived, the patrol lights illuminated the tombstones and the entrance to an old, ruined chapel. A police forensic doctor intercepted me immediately, his pale face reflecting the weight of what he had witnessed. "The body we found is Augusto Vitals, the art collector," he explained. "He's alive, but his body is a porcelain doll. I've never seen anything like it. He's fragile, incredibly fragile, and I'm afraid any movement could kill him. Maybe you can help us? A sharp cold ran down my spine. Augusto Vidal? Alive? My mind flooded with questions as I followed the forensic doctor into the chapel. When the doors opened, the scene that greeted me was indescribable. Sitting in an old wooden chair, under the flickering light of meticulously placed candles, was Augusto Vidal. But he wasn't the man I remembered from newspaper and magazine photos. His entire body was made of porcelain, but not like the corpse I had examined in the morgue. This was different. His ceramic skin was so fine and detailed that it captured the light in an almost supernatural way. Every feature, from the lines on his face to the wrinkles on his hands, was replicated with sickening precision. What struck me most were his eyes. They weren't glass like the corpses. They were real, alive, and blinking with effort. My body trembled as I approached. It was a mix of terror and awe that I felt. What lay before me wasn't just a scene from a nightmare. It was a medical and artistic feat that defied all logic. "Augusto," I murmured, trying to stay calm. He turned his head slowly toward me, his movements stiff and mechanical, as if every gesture cost him monumental effort. In a weak, almost whispery voice, he said, "Am I not beautiful now? I don't suffer. I don't age. I'm finally perfect." His words left me breathless. There was no madness in his tone, just an unsettling serenity, a deep resignation. I wanted to say something to warn him not to move, but my words got stuck in my throat. Then Augusto began to rise from the chair. His movements were slow and clumsy, and the creaking of the porcelain echoed through the chapel like a symphony of horror. "Augusto, don't get up," I shouted, but it was too late. He took a step forward, and with a sharp, grating sound, his body collapsed. The impact was catastrophic. His delicate porcelain structure shattered into 1,000 pieces, scattering fragments across the chapel floor. But the worst wasn't that. Inside the ceramic remains were his organs, torn and exposed as if they had been encapsulated in an artificial shell. The blood, coagulated and dark, mixed with the porcelain fragments, creating a grotesque scene that seemed ripped from a nightmare. I stood frozen, staring at the remains of what was once a man. In his fall, Augusto Vidal had found the fragility he so feared. Days later, as I reviewed the reports and tried to make sense of what had happened, I couldn't stop thinking about his last words, "I'm beautiful now." Had he achieved the perfection he so desperately sought? Or had he simply lost himself in a mirage, in an obsession that led him to lose what made him human? The truth is, I don't know. All I can say with certainty is this: the beauty Augusto Vidal sought was nothing more than an empty illusion, a desperate attempt to escape the inevitable. But in the end, not even porcelain could protect him from the fate we all share. As I write these words, his voice still echoes in my mind, a disturbing reminder that the pursuit of perfection can turn us into something we can't even recognize. And when the price is so high, one wonders if it's worth paying. Perfection, after all, is just another form of death. I wonder if, in the end, like in the tale, he found freedom, or if he simply died without ever truly finding his real body. Next story. My name is Miguel Zamora, and I'm a police officer in a small town called San Gabriel. Not much happens here, aside from neighborly disputes and the occasional petty theft. But a week ago, something occurred, something I can't explain or forget. It sounds crazy to say it, but I suspect that a cloth doll is connected to the murder of a family. The Sanchez family, my neighbors. It all started on an ordinary morning. I was leaving my house for my shift when I noticed that the Sanchez family's front door was slightly ajar. This was strange, as they were extremely careful people. As I approached, I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. I decided to go in to make sure everything was okay. What I found when I crossed the threshold was a scene that will haunt me forever. The place was silent, but the air felt heavy, charged with something indefinable. In the living room, I saw the three members of the family: Samuel Sanchez, his wife Clara, and their 6-year-old daughter, Valeria. They were sitting on the couch, their eyes wide open, as if they were staring at something that had paralyzed them with terror. Their bodies were rigid, frozen in an unnatural position, and a trickle of dried blood ran from their mouths. They looked dead. Yet, There were no signs of violence, no weapons, nothing to indicate what had happened. That's when I saw it for the first time. A cloth doll, sitting on the table in front of them, its little head tilted and a crooked smile stitched onto its face. It was an ordinary doll, made of brown fabric and dressed in a red dress. Its eyes were two black buttons that seemed to shine in the dim light. Something about it deeply unsettled me, but I tried not to let my emotions take over. It was just a doll, right? While waiting for backup, I walked around the house looking for clues. The kitchen was untouched, as were the bedrooms. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail. In Valeria's room, on her desk, I found an open notebook. On one page, there was a child's drawing, the Sanchez family sitting on the couch, with the doll in the center. Below the drawing, in clumsy handwriting, Valeria had written, "She wants to play with us. She says we won't be alone for long." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just a child's imagination, but something didn't add up. I went back to the living room, and there was the doll, exactly in the same position, with its unsettling smile. But I could have sworn its button eyes were staring directly at me. That night, after my shift ended, I tried to push the image out of my mind, but I couldn't. What had happened in that house? What did the doll have to do with it? Was it possible that something so simple was connected to such a disturbing tragedy? I decided not to tell my superiors. I would keep the case to myself and look for answers on my own. I knew that if I said out loud what I really thought, they'd take me for a madman. But one thing was certain, that doll was no ordinary toy, and I was determined to uncover the truth. Since that morning in the Sanchez family's house, something in me changed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cloth doll with its crooked smile and button eyes. I felt like it was watching me even in my dreams, as if it knew I had noticed it. The bodies of the Sanchez family were taken to the coroner. The preliminary results were baffling. There were no visible wounds or signs of violence, but their hearts had simply stopped. The official cause was listed as simultaneous cardiac arrest, which was practically impossible. Meanwhile, I used my access as an officer to review the neighborhood's records. I wanted to understand where the doll had come from. I went straight to the section on complaints and rumors. To my surprise, over 30 years ago, another family that had lived in that same house died under similar circumstances. According to the report, the parents and their only child were found dead in the living room, with expressions of terror on their faces. No one mentioned a doll, but the coincidence was chilling. I couldn't leave it at that. I looked for information about the previous owners of the house. I discovered that the doll had belonged to a woman named Amelia Dominguez, who lived there in the 1950s. She was a seamstress known for making dolls for the children in town. According to rumors, Amelia lost her daughter in a tragic accident, and in her grief, she made a doll that, she claimed, contained her daughter's soul. The locals avoided her after that, and Amelia died in solitude. The house remained empty until the Sanchez family moved in. I decided to go back to the house. I knew the doll was still there. The crime scene had been sealed, but the forensics team hadn't considered it relevant evidence. When I entered, the same oppressive atmosphere enveloped me. The doll was on the couch, in the same spot where I had left it. But something was wrong. I noticed that the doll seemed different. Its red dress was more worn, and one of its button eyes had a slight scratch, as if it had been moving. It was impossible, of course, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was undeniable. I turned on a flashlight and began inspecting the house again. I went up to Valeria's room and headed straight for the notebook I had found the first time. There were new words written in the same childish handwriting. She says not to interfere. She doesn't want you to find her. Fear turned into determination. If there was something that doll wanted to hide, I would uncover it. I started searching the darkest corners of the house. In the basement, I found a hidden trapdoor under some loose floorboards. I opened it carefully, and the smell of dampness and confinement hit me immediately. I descended with my flashlight, and what I saw left me frozen. In the center of the space was a circle of dolls, all made of cloth and placed as if they were watching something in the middle. There, in the center of the circle, was an improvised altar with an old photo of a girl, likely Amelia Dominguez's daughter. The cloth doll in the living room was identical to the one in the photo. The altar also contained personal items: a hairbrush, a small dress, and most disturbingly, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. Around the altar were marks carved into the floor, symbols I didn't recognize but that seemed ancient. Everything pointed to Amelia having tried to bind her daughter's soul to that doll. Suddenly, I heard something upstairs, a faint sound, like tiny footsteps running across the wooden floor. I rushed up, gun in hand, and there it was. The doll was no longer on the couch. I found it in the hallway, sitting by the front door, as if it were waiting. My breathing was ragged, and my heart was pounding. I knew I had to get rid of that thing, but something stopped me. A whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, echoed in the living room. "You can't stop me. This isn't over." I ran out of the house, leaving the doll behind. In the days that followed, I tried to continue the investigation, but something seemed to block me at every turn. The Sanchez family's house had been sold to a local businessman who planned to demolish it to build an apartment complex. The most unsettling part was that the doll had disappeared. I checked the case inventory and the crime scene, but there was no trace of it. A week later, while on patrol, we received an emergency call. During the demolition of the house, the workers had found something in the rubble. I headed to the scene with 2 patrol cars and an ambulance, feeling the same chill as the first time I entered that house. When we arrived, the workers were gathered, pale and silent. Amid the rubble lay the body of a woman. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her body, extremely thin, seemed on the verge of falling apart. She barely had any hair, and her appearance was so unsettling that even the paramedics hesitated before touching her. The coroners confirmed she was dead. Days later, the final report brought the most disturbing revelation: the woman's DNA matched old records. She was Amelia Dominguez's daughter, the same girl who had supposedly died over 70 years ago. The news shook the town, but for me, it was like a piece of a cursed puzzle falling into the wrong place. If the girl had been alive all this time, where had she been? How had she ended up under the rubble of that house? The worst part was that I still had no answers about my neighbors. The death of Amelia's daughter should have closed the case, but instead, it left it more open than ever. Every time I remembered the scene of the Sanchez family, their rigid bodies and the doll in the center, something told me that the voice I had heard that night, the whisper in the darkness, belonged to that woman. I'll never know for sure what happened in that house or what connection the doll had to it all. The only thing I know is that the answers are buried with Amelia's daughter, and the dead don't speak. But I'm sure of one thing: that doll, with its crooked smile and button eyes, was the key to everything. And now, every night, when silence fills my home, I fear hearing that voice again. Because even though everything seems over, I know there's something I should never have unearthed.